So I'm going to jump into a quick preview of one of my favorite ways of teaching the complexity of colonial Vietnam, that is how to teach reading and critical analysis of primary sources. And this is really fundamental because these, I believe, are fundamental critical thinking skills that are kind of interoperable and really transmit to different types of fields beyond studying Vietnam, beyond studying history, but really cultivate critical thinkers, empathetic individuals, and global citizens. So I'm going to just really quickly introduce many of the resources that I outlined to help to inspire and help to guide some of the curriculum writers today. So one of the challenges of studying colonial Vietnam is that often the sources are biased, they're limited, they're hard to find, at times they're difficult to read, and often complex answers are not easily found online. So let's take this image, for example, which was actually a still from a short video. I describe how to analyze primary sources with 3 steps. The first step is really about seeing and describing, not really interpreting. What's going on? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find? The second step is more about interpreting and making meaning. How is blank represented? So in this case, how are women represented? How are children represented? How is the house represented? Who is the subject matter and why is that important? What is not represented in this still, and then I'll play the video in a second. And the third is further investigation and visual evidence. So thinking more about the historical, political, and economic context of the primary source. Why was the source created? Who is the intended audience? So what does this visual source reveal that is slightly different than textual sources? So I'll play this just to get a sense of the complexity of how one might analyze a primary source. Here we are. So this was actually still a short film that's created in 1900, and it depicts 2 French women who are throwing coins onto the floor as indigenous, most likely Vietnamese children, and some women are picking up coins from the floor. So this video still elicits a lot of both curiosity, emotional response from many of my students, and I think it's really important to walk students through the multiple steps as to how to analyze a source like this, how to think critically and respond to it, both situated within the historical context, and try to dig deeper and understand not only what the source is representing, but possibly why it was created. So a source like this could really shape our understanding of Vietnamese history, questions of agency, of culture, and who has power. So one of the activities and the different sources that I cultivate is focused on touring Colonial Hanoi. And the goal of, or the primary sources and media sources that I organize around this are really focused on 2. A historic film that was produced by a British-French news documentary company. Second is a creative remix of historical comments from 1930s Vietnamese language newspapers. And third of this are supplementary sources, a colonial tourist guide for French tourists to Indochina produced by a tourism company. And fourth is a satirical, semi-fictional travelog that's written by a Vietnamese journalist named Nhất Linh, who documents his real-life experiences traveling to France in the 1930s. The learning outcomes here is first to immerse oneself in historic urban changes in colonial Vietnam. Second, to understand different perspectives and audiences from primary sources. Third is to critically analyze different representations of history. And fourth is to rethink history of colonial tourism and legacies today. So as you can click through the sources, you can get a better sense of what they are. I have a few guided questions. So on this short film, Women of Hanoi, it's really only a 3-minute film, but it kind of gives a sense of different types of urban street scenes of what Hanoi might look like. And I have some curated questions that could guide you at different points. And in this source, I think it's really interesting because there's different ways that you can kind of compare and contrast historic Hanoi, so this is 1930, to maybe contemporary Hanoi. And some of the students might have either firsthand or touristic experiences of traveling to Hanoi today. One of my very ambitious creative students in Sonia Boy, we worked on this creative story together called Modernizing the City. And I wanted to at least introduce this um, story as one of the creative ways to interact and rethink historic historic comics, and also as an interesting idea as a pedagogical assignment for students to remake historic sources to rethink the power of narrative. So what my student Sonia did is that she took, and I'll go to her explanatory page, she took some of the drawings that were in some of the most popular Vietnamese newspapers that were published within the 1930s, so many comics and graphic illustrations in these newspapers, and she basically copied and pasted and cut them apart from these pages, from advertisements to drawings of cars to illustrations, and then through this weaving together, she stitched a different narrative of what one might experience and feel about colonial Hanoi, but from multiple perspectives, from kind of what you might think of as kind of a more indigenous perspective, from a perspective that that might not have been represented, not really from a French colonial perspective, but to think about a local perspective. So thinking from a children's perspective, from a woman's perspective, or maybe a country bumpkin. So from here, what's great about this source is it's actually just made in Google Slides. So pretend you selected bumpkin, it's links there, and then it'll write through and kind of create a little narrative. So I left home and spent 3 days walking from Hai Binh to Hanoi. I'll figure something out, find some work to make ends meet. So this is her creative writing here. And then she's talking, she shows here, and she uses a comic of this country bumpkin, thinking, oh, I'll just walk according to this little sign of how far Hanoi is from Hai Binh. So there you can actually go from here. And then it goes into like an interesting, oh, I'm sorry. So the best thing to do here is actually you have to go into slideshow mode to best view and experience this. So I hope that wasn't confusing. So here, what you do next is you just, after you click, you advance on the right arrow, and then the narrative will advance in this way. So just remember that, because I kind of demoed it not in slideshow mode, so it was a little bit confusing, but here you can advance through in this way by just clicking the arrow mode, and then it will advance the story as so. If you see areas that have a click, you can go through and you can actually click to advance to there as well. So let me just escape. If there's an arrow, you can click back. So it's somewhat straightforward in that sense, as long as you click slideshow mode from the beginning. So from here, let me just show again. You click slideshow mode, and then you click the right arrow, and then you click what character you want to follow through. So here's the mother, so then I'll go like through the dialogue, like, what are you doing out there? Ma, you're back, coming, and it'll go through her storyline. And what's really interesting here is that Sonia and I worked really hard to rethink kind of different representations and experiences of those who are underrepresented, particularly women, and thinking about kind of gendered experiences within different types of work in colonial life. So that's this second source. An interesting source to think about tourism is from a Vietnamese perspective, a Vietnamese person going to France for the first time in the 30s. And this is actually has been translated. It was originally written in Vietnamese. The introductory essay is really helpful to talk about just the literary value of this story, how it circulated, how popular it was, to think about to characterize so many of the Vietnamese youth who are going to France to study. But let me just read. So that's like the introductory essay. There's some illustrations as well. But what's really interesting is that it's written here. Here's when it begins here. It's going to France. It's seen as it's represented like a diary of a journey abroad. And it's written satirically and semi-fictionally based off of Nhất Linh, who actually did go to France and kind of draws from his own experience. So, like one interesting, so he'll say like really interesting kind of commentary about waiting to go to France. Um, I think what was one of the interesting experiences that I wanted to. So he'll like travel and he stops in Singapore. He goes by boat, and there's a lot of jokes that are really interesting. So here's like one joke, for example. He was in charge of Singapore. So I asked, "What did you call Singapore?" And he goes, "Sinza Ball, giving birth to a cow." Well, he says, "That's very strange." And he goes, "You shouldn't be surprised, sir. We give our own names to every port of call. For example, we call Colombo Golongbong, Miss Vagabond. Djibouti, Djibouti, to have a little suck. Port Said is Saik, horse cart driver." So there's all these kind of like tongue-in-cheek type characterizations of all these places. And what's interesting is even when he goes, and travels, he kind of learns and experiences new places and has all these like bumbling experiences. And it's really interesting when he gets to France, like how he comments on like public life and how different like French culture is. And it's a really fascinating glimpse into how what Vietnamese thought of France during that time. So the contrast in that is the last of the sources, which is really interesting. It's translated from French and it's called Glimpses of a Great Tourist Country by in 1938. So what's interesting here was it was created by the Office of Tourism in Indochina, and it's very much tailored both to French and Anglophone, so English speaking, so British, American, and Australian, those who would come to Indochina possibly for tourism. So like even a close analysis of this map would be really interesting. So in this source, it says a map of French Indochina, the country that must be included next tour. The interesting thing is in this digitized edition, someone had crossed it out and wrote Greater Vietnam. I'm not really sure about the provenance of this, but here it's tourist map, right? So what's interesting is as you analyze what is a tourist map, the focus, like what is in the key here, is a frontier, state boundaries, railways, roads, passable, shipping lines, airlines, and places of quote unquote particular interest, such as Angkor, for example, or highlight here, Dalat, areas that actually, if you think today, are still very popular tourist destinations. And if you were to compare kind of these tourist, writings today to maybe like Nhất Lin's journey of going to France, it's really interesting. So here it begins. It would be impossible to depict Indochina today in a detailed way, and the limit spaces, field spaces will give you an idea. So here's like the population, and it kind of gives a little bit of a background, but then there's like very much kind of these simplistic caricatures and kind of problematic ways of representing culture and identity of through a touristic lens. So that's kind of just my quick overview of the different sources. I hope you have a lot of fun kind of creating curriculum out of them. There's, of course, many other sources, but these are other curated ones that I could suggest that if you wanted to do a module on colonial tourism, and if you wanted to even bring it up to thinking about the 50s and 60s, about just questions of cultural essentialism. So there's essentially a United States version of a guide of Vietnam that you can read here. And this is an interesting cultural translation guide by 1960, written by a Vietnamese individual who explains the cultural differences between East and West, really targeted to explain to American population during the social relations during the Vietnam War. And then if you are more interested in thinking about legacies of colonialism and division, what's interesting here are lots of maps. So by the 1950 visual representations of Vietnam is that the U.S. is interested in Vietnam as aid but not intervention. Even by 54, the U.S. is interested in preventing the spread of communism, and there's national sentiments of Vietnam, so you can see it in these maps. And there's also this other kind of colonial, post-colonial U.S. resource that is described here to kind of think about the colonial legacies. Again, it was such a pleasure, and I really hope that we get a chance to engage. Please feel free to reach out either through my email, or I'm also on Twitter. I hope you the best of luck, and thank you so much for all of your hard work.